This is Ashna Malpani, and you're listening to the University of Chicago's Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is Siddhant Wadera, and I am the production manager for The Main Page, our podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. Today we have the third and final installment of our mini-series on the Supreme Court, democracy, and election law. You'll hear Jake Foose interview Penn State Professor of Communications and Political Science, John Gastil. Jake and Professor Gastil talk about deliberative democracy in the United States and around the world. Just a quick note before we begin. This episode was recorded remotely due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Without further ado, here's Professor John Gastil.
Today we are joined by John Gastil, Professor of Communication and Political Science at Penn State. Dr. Gastil is a senior scholar at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, where he studies political decision-making and group decision-making across a range of contexts. Dr. Gastil, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Gastil, before we get into it, a lot of your research seems to be in the process of deliberative democracy. So, for any specifics, what is deliberative democracy?
Well, let's start with democracy, right? It's the concept of self-government, right? We should govern ourselves, make our own laws, rules, and so on to decide how to live together. Deliberative democracy says, hey, when we're doing that, how about if we deliberate before we make those decisions? How about if we listen to each other, think this through, make arguments, offer evidence, refutation, and so on? We take it for granted that that happens, but the theory of deliberative democracy came along because you really shouldn't take that for granted. It replaced a more participatory model that emphasized, rightly, mass participation. Let's get everyone into the process. And only at that point did it become obvious that, this system, whether it's an elite democracy or participatory, isn't really as deliberative as it needs to be. So that's what the emphasis of deliberative democracy is improving the quality of talk throughout the entire political system.
How does this point in time, and I'm going to let you take that however you want to this day, how does that create opportunities to institute deliberative democracy?
We can make a distinction between the United States and really the rest of the world. Here in the United States, I think there's an appetite for a more deliberative electoral process where we feel that there's a more rigorous exchange of ideas, more principled debate, more honest discussion of different experiences and perspectives. We've really got a lot of divides we need to bridge, and we have some very serious issues we need to tackle. And what we're seeing in this 2020 election doesn't make people confident that we're up to the task. So I think there's an appetite for deliberation. We'll talk about some of the reforms that are being proposed. Outside of the United States, there's some of the same problems, right? The rise of a certain kind of populism is very anti-deliberative. But we're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation in deliberative democracy around the world. We can talk about those examples too, but really the leaders in this right now are in countries like Ireland and Belgium and Australia. So the United States has some of its own kind of original contributions, but the innovation is happening faster elsewhere.
So in the states and systems such as Ireland, Belgium, or even the ones in the United States that have instituted deliberative systems, what conditions, what movements fostered those kind of changes to the democratic system?
Well, let's take kind of an old example and a new one just for the sake of contrast. The oldest example of a deliberative body that involves everyday citizens, and deliberative democracy isn't just about citizens, it also cares about how deliberative, say, a legislative body is, but its emphasis is on citizens. The jury system is the oldest one, and people just overlook it. They kind of forget that this American democracy places a good deal of faith in everyday citizens populating this important part of the judicial branch. They appear in the Constitution multiple times. Well, the jury was something that was created over centuries, right? Of one case after another, helping to establish its independence, helping to establish the norms of it, and we're still trying to improve it. We're trying to make the jury selection more equitable. We're trying to give jurors a better chance to deliberate. Only recently have jurors been allowed to take notes and ask questions. They have to do it through the bailiff and so on. But these innovations are meant to create a stronger kind of deliberation in the jury, even before they go to the deliberation room. Now, what caused that to happen? Well, really, that's a story of thousands and thousands of people, from judges to attorneys to activists to jurors themselves, sometimes suing the court, who created the best features of the modern jury system. By contrast, the kind of innovations we'll probably talk more about today, they are a little bit of a break with tradition and happen somewhat suddenly in a matter of years. And that requires real focused leadership, people who are determined to see a change come about. And that's how it happens, is that people really step up and make the case for why we have to change the way we make laws, the way we conduct elections, what have you. That's not sort of a long historical organic process so much as it is a kind of galvanizing sort of leadership that demands change in our democratic system.
So would you say that countries that have a deliberative jury system is a common thread through countries that have instituted your focus of democratic deliberation of change, or is that almost independent?
Independent. It's certainly the case that where you have an existing jury system, there is a model of deliberation, even just a linguistic model. Right? What does it mean to deliberate? Well, we think of jury deliberation. Oh, right, jury deliberation. The funny thing about that is most people haven't served on a jury at whatever point in their life they're on. All right, the percentage of trials that go to jury in the United States has gradually declined. They're still tremendously important, but the point is that you know about jury deliberation without ever having done it. And the irony of there, again, is that jury deliberation is the one part of the trial process that can't be observed by anyone but the jurors, by law. Judges make a few exceptions for research every now and then, but very rarely. So not only have you not done it, but you haven't really seen it. And yet it's in our cultural imagination. So again, in countries with the jury, that kind of helps because our imagination tends to be somewhat favorable. Public opinion towards the jury in the United States, for instance, is incredibly favorable, particularly for criminal juries. The Republican Party has, for the last few decades, attacked the civil jury as a threat to, fairness and it promotes a kind of anti-business and anti-doctor, malpractice. So that isn't well borne out, by the way, by the empirical record. But the fact is that public confidence in the civil jury has been damaged by that attack. So it's still favorable, but it's not as high as the criminal jury, which obviously has come under criticism as well, but not in the same sustained partisan way. In other countries, it's interesting that the American jury is sometimes looked at with great admiration. So Japan, South Korea, Argentina are just a few of the countries that only in recent years have established their version of a jury system, and they looked directly to the United States for their model of how to build that new system. And in Argentina and Japan in particular, I know that part of the justification for creating a jury was to bolster their democracy. They believed in the democratizing effect of jury service, which I know about because I literally wrote a book called The Jury and Democracy, which makes this case, and I've had the chance to visit those countries and talk with folks there. And it is exciting that they get that connection, that serving on a jury is a powerful experience for a lot of people that reminds them that democracy is self-government. Right? Filling out a ballot is all well and good, and everybody's doing it. That's great. We're going to have high turnout this year. But filling out a ballot isn't nearly as potent as sitting there on a jury and realizing, especially if it requires unanimity, that that person's freedom is in your hands right now. What are you going to do? Right? That's something else, and it can really leave an impression. And we found that it actually makes jurors more likely to vote for years to come, that it has this contagion effect that radiates out into other kinds of civic duties that they might be called upon.
All right, so that leads nicely into a question, a basic one I want to ask about your new book, Hope for Democracy, and about the work with the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review.
Sure. So that's, the reason I studied the jury for 10 years is I had written a book called By Popular Demand back in 2000. Worst timed book ever. That's the year of the hanging chads and the presidential election that dragged on and on because the butterfly ballots in one county and then these other, my book basically argued for making ballots more complicated. I thought is really what democracy needed, was a more complicated physical ballot. That part of my argument didn't go over very well. But I argued for the creation of these randomly selected citizen panels that would write essentially issue analyses to go into the voter guide for voters. But I knew that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So great to write kind of a theoretical book that proposes a design and an empirical justification for it. But then I thought I should probably go study deliberation that actually exists. And fortunately, a friend of mine and I were kicking the tires on something, and then my spouse said, "Hey, why don't you go study the jury? That you can actually." She pointed out that you can get jury records. We were a little skeptical, and in fact, now they've locked it down. So we may have had a lucky moment in time. But at the end of that 10 years, the state of Oregon had in fact implemented the thing I'd proposed back in 2000. So for the last 10 years, with Katie Knobloch and a dozen other colleagues, we've studied this process in Oregon that sure enough uses a random sample every 2 years to evaluate ballot measures. And then that one-page analysis written by this body of your peers goes into the voter guide that is mailed to every voter. Now remember, Oregon is a vote-by-mail state, so voters are getting their ballot, and they're getting their voting guide, and when they open up to look at Measure 73, they'll very quickly find a page written by a group of 20 to 24 Oregonians who had a full week to sit down with people pro and con on this issue, along with some neutral experts, and really think through this question of whether we should vote on Measure 73. Now, what they give you as a voter is a list of key findings. Look, you got to know these things before you vote. And here's what, at the end of the day, we found to be the strongest arguments for and against. You make up your mind. Initially, that page also included a vote tally. It would say, oh, by the way, the 24 of us split 21-3 against this law. You decide, but come on. And now they've changed that. They've actually removed that little detail. And it's a fair criticism, which is really 24 people can write a great statement, very robust, reliable, accurate, but knowing their vote count is kind of disrespecting statistics and inference. It is just 24 people. It's not 240 people or something. So that's gone. And other places that are thinking of adopting this process also similarly, I think, are not going to include that number. But the point is the content. The point is that, to my surprise, remember back in 2000, I wanted to make ballots complicated. I wanted to get information on the ballot because I didn't think anyone could be bothered to read anything besides the one piece of paper they had to mark, right? It's like, you're going to write on the test, you're not going to write in a workbook. And Oregon proved me wrong. I mean, people actually do want to read that statement. That one page doesn't take long, and often pretty quickly you find out what you need to know, and you're good to go in 30 seconds.
So what has the reception? So the CIR has been around for a little bit. What's the reception been? How have you measured its successes, and how have you measured its failures?
We've had two principal questions that Katie and I were answering. The first one is, what is the quality of the deliberation, right? If this group of 24 Oregonians do a terrible job of thinking through the issue and writing that statement, nothing else really matters. At that point, it's just a failure. Right. In fact, if they have an influence, that's a bad thing. If their deliberation is bad and they're creating a bad statement. Fortunately, they're doing pretty well. As a professor, when I was trying to figure out how to communicate to the legislature an evaluation of the process, I used a grading scale, and they really liked it. I said, you know what? If you look at the CIRs, and now there have been quite a few since 2010. It's kind of a B+ student who sometimes gets an A-, right? They do a pretty good job, right? I don't think it's the best work, but it's really solid. And when you compare that to what voters know without it, yikes, right? It's super important that they get this information. There are limitations in the deliberation. They sometimes don't go as deep into, say, some of the values questions underlying an issue. They tend to focus in a more minute kind of way on facts. Well, that's safer territory for them anyway, so I understand why that happens. But that's one of the reasons I think that they underperform a little. But again, it's good work. As for the second